Matthew chapter 13 is rich with parables that teach about the nature and value of the kingdom of heaven and the various responses to the gospel. Matthew chapter 13 verses 1 through 23. Jesus tells the parable of the sower, describing how different types of soil, representing people's hearts, receive the seeds, which is the word of God. He later explains the parable to his disciples, highlighting the varying responses to the gospel. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30 and 36 through 43. Jesus tells the parable of the weeds, where an enemy sows weeds among the wheat. Both grow together until the harvest, when they are separated. Jesus explains that the good seed represents the children of the kingdom, and the weeds represent the children of the evil one. Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 33. Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed, which starts small, but grows into a large tree, and to yeast, which permeates dough. Matthew chapter 13, verses 44 through 46. Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to hidden treasure and a pearl of great value, emphasizing its worth and the joy of finding it. Matthew chapter 13, verses 47 through 50. Jesus describes the kingdom of heaven like a fishing net that catches all kinds of fish. At the end of the age, the good fish, which represent righteous people, are separated from the bad fish, which represent wicked people. Matthew chapter 13, verses 41 through 58. Jesus asks his disciples if they understand the parables, and they affirm that they do. He then compares them to scribes who bring out new and old treasures. The chapter ends with Jesus being rejected in his own hometown of Nazareth. Matthew chapter 14 highlights the compassion, miraculous power, and divine authority of Jesus, as well as the importance of faith and recognition of Jesus as the Son of God. Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. Herod Antipas hears about Jesus and is troubled, thinking he might be John the Baptist risen from the dead. The chapter recounts how Herod, influenced by Herodias and her daughter, ordered the beheading of John the Baptist and how John's disciples buried his body. Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. Upon hearing of John's death, Jesus withdraws to a solitary place. However, the crowds follow him. Moved with compassion, Jesus heals the sick and then miraculously feeds 5,000 men, plus women and children, with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. After sending the disciples ahead in a boat, Jesus goes up a mountain to pray. In the middle of the night, Jesus walks on the water toward the disciples' boat. Peter attempts to walk on the water toward Jesus, but begins to sink when he loses faith. Jesus saves him and calms the storm, and the disciples worship Jesus, acknowledging him as the Son of God. Matthew chapter 14, verses 34 through 36. Arriving in Gennesaret, Jesus is recognized by the people who bring all their sick to him. They beg to touch the fringe of his cloak, and all who do are healed. Matthew chapter 15 highlights Jesus' teachings on true purity, his responsiveness to faith regardless of ethnic background, and his compassion for the needs of the people. Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 20. Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees and scribes about his disciples not following traditional hand-washing rituals. Jesus responds by criticizing the Pharisees for putting their traditions above God's commandments. He teaches that what defiles a person comes from the heart, not from external practices or foods. Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Jesus travels to the region of Tyre and Sidon, where a Canaanite woman begs him to heal her demon-possessed daughter. Initially, Jesus tests her faith by saying he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. The woman persists, demonstrating great faith, and Jesus heals her daughter, commending her faith. Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 through 31. Jesus returns to the Sea of Galilee and goes up on a mountainside. Large crowds bring the sick, the lame, the blind, the mute, and many others to him, and he heals them all. The people are amazed and praise the God of Israel. Matthew chapter 15, verses 32 through 39. Jesus, moved with compassion for the crowd that has been with him for 3 days with nothing to eat, performs another miraculous feeding. He takes 7 loaves and a few small fish, gives thanks, breaks them, and distributes them to the crowd. Everyone eats and is satisfied, and 7 baskets of leftovers are collected. Matthew chapter 16 addresses the recognition of Jesus' true identity, the warning against false teachings, the prediction of Jesus' suffering and resurrection, and the call to committed discipleship. Matthew chapter 16, verses 1 through 4. The Pharisees and Sadducees demand a sign from Jesus to prove his authority. Jesus rebukes them, saying that they can interpret the weather, but not the signs of the times. He refers to the sign of Jonah as the only sign that they will receive. Matthew chapter 16, verses 5 through 12. Jesus warns his disciples to beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. The disciples misunderstand, thinking he is talking about bread. Jesus clarifies that he is warning them about the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. Jesus asks his disciples who people say he is, and then he asks them who they say he is. Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus blesses Peter, declaring that his confession is the rock on which he will build his church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 23. Jesus begins to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, be killed, and be raised on the 3rd day. Peter rebukes Jesus, but Jesus responds by calling Peter a stumbling block and emphasizes that Peter's concerns are human and not divine. Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 through 28. Jesus teaches about the cost of discipleship, calling his followers to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. He emphasizes that whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for his sake will find it. He also speaks of the Son of Man coming in his Father's glory and rewarding each person according to what they have done. Matthew chapter 17 highlights the divine nature of Jesus through the transfiguration, his authority over demons, his foreknowledge of his own death and resurrection, and his consideration for social norms despite his divine status. Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 13. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a high mountain. There he is transfigured before them, his face shining like the sun, and his clothes becoming as white as light. Moses and Elijah appear, talking with Jesus. Peter suggests building 3 shelters, but a voice from a cloud declares, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." The disciples fall face down in fear, but Jesus touches them and tells them not to be afraid. As they descend the mountain, Jesus instructs them not to tell anyone about the vision until after his resurrection. The disciples ask about Elijah, and Jesus explains that Elijah has already come, referring to John the Baptist. Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 through 21. A man approaches Jesus, pleading for help for his demon-possessed son, whom the disciples could not heal. Jesus rebukes the demon and it leaves the boy immediately. The disciples ask why they couldn't drive out the demon, and Jesus explains that their faith was too small. He emphasizes the power of faith, saying that even faith as small as a mustard seed can move mountains. Matthew chapter 17, verses 22 through 23. Jesus tells his disciples again that he will be betrayed, killed, and raised to life on the third day. The disciples are filled with grief upon hearing this. Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. In Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax ask Peter if Jesus pays the tax. Jesus discusses the matter with Peter, implying that as the Son of God, he is exempt. However, to avoid causing offense, he instructs Peter to catch a fish in whose mouth Peter finds a 4 drachma coin, enough to pay the tax for both Jesus and Peter. Thank you for listening. Consider liking and following. I upload a chapter summary of the New Testament each weekday.